The comms were lagging. Wind was rising. The convoy hadn't moved in 7 minutes. Everyone blamed the terrain. The signal drop. The weather, everything but the plan itself. Specialist Mira Hale sat at the secondary terminal, where no one was looking. She ran the footage again. One frame caught her eye. Then another. She didn't ask permission. She keyed in the correction vector and rerouted the uplink herself. The convoy rolled forward 60 seconds later. Command never mentioned her name, but the new protocol used her timing. The base had fallen into a kind of mechanical silence, the kind built by engineers, not nature. Outside, the hurricane pressed against the sealed infrastructure of Joint Base Corinth with the slow persistence of a rising tide. Wind flattening against reinforced walls until the vibrations passed through the floors like a heartbeat. Inside, the only sound was the hum of backup generators and the timed click of security doors, auto-locking down a hallway. Camille Voss had already passed through. She moved alone, her boots quiet on the rubberized flooring, one hand brushing against the metal rail as she turned the corner near the lower CBRN wing. The emergency lights blinked in slow intervals, each pulse staining the corridor in amber before fading to dull gray. At 30-second gaps, the next bulb would spark to life just enough for safety protocol. Never enough for comfort. Camille didn't flinch in the dark between pulses. She knew this stretch by heart. There was nothing here she hadn't walked before. Often after hours. Often alone. Back when her access badge still meant something. Now it just opened doors no one else bothered to use. Her lab sat behind 2 sealed hatches on the auxiliary floor, where decon protocols used to run twice a day before funding shifted. The panel flickered when she keyed in her code. She watched the digits lag by half a second. Then confirm green. No one else had signed in for 4 days. She stepped inside, letting the door seal behind her with a sigh of pressure and a faint hydraulic stutter that hadn't been serviced in weeks. The air smelled like it always did, cold. Filtered. Faintly metallic. The samples cabinet was still locked, its latch untouched since her last audit. She pulled on a pair of gloves, opened the containment drawer, and checked the internal gauges. No drift. No tampering. Just rows of coded vials and a set of air quality test kits sealed in foil packs. Most of them would expire unused. She logged the check manually in the binder on the desk. Flipping past 2 months of untouched pages, the logbook spine was cracked where she always opened it. Her handwriting was the only one inside. In the far corner, a humidity sensor blinked amber. It had done that for weeks. She'd filed a maintenance report. Twice. It was still in queue. Camille pulled out her handheld barometer and ran a pressure sweep along the ceiling vent. The reading came back clean. Still, she noted the result in the margin of her checklist. She always did. Not because anyone asked, but because someone had to. A faint vibration ran through the floor, external structure flexing under storm load. The lab walls groaned. Quiet and deep, like the building was inhaling and didn't want to let go. There was a time she had briefed joint operations here. Early in her tour, that was before she raised a concern over test sampling from the Ridge 9 field trial. Not a whistleblower, just a professional warning. But it had been enough. A committee was formed. A panel concluded it was an overinterpretation of protocol thresholds. The findings were reviewed. Then the files were buried. Her assignments thinned. Her clearance was never revoked. Just unused. Command had rotated out. The new leads didn't need her on the call sheet. Camille walked back into the corridor, letting the lights blink ahead of her. The hallway felt longer now. She paused under the intake shaft and checked the flow temperature with the back of her hand. It was colder than before. Not by much. She wrote it down anyway. Somewhere beneath the drone of the HVAC. The storm pressed harder. You could feel it in the walls if you stopped moving. The whole base was in a kind of breath-hold systems, idling. People tucked behind sealed command doors. Comms throttled to internal only. She passed a message board near the stairwell. A sticky note fluttered loose and dropped to the floor. No one would pick it up. As she stepped through the last checkpoint on the corridor, the door clicked behind her. The sound echoed just a little too long in the empty passage. Camille didn't turn. She just kept walking. The old binder tucked under her arm. Her notes tucked in the crease where no one else would read them. The system still worked. It just no longer needed her name in it. The first alarm came as a short, clipped burst over the narrowband, a corridor seal, and a med alert west of logistics intake. Camille heard it while passing the water station on sublevel 3. She paused only long enough to verify the sector code, then adjusted course. No one called her in. She just moved that way. Boots striking damp vinyl as the light above her flickered through its 30-second interval. The West Wing hallway smelled faintly of soaked fabric, bleach residue, and something sour trying to hide behind chemical wipes. A trail of boot prints led to a knot of figures crouched near the base of a service hatch. A young technician lay sprawled across the floor tiles, his utility uniform soaked along the back, one sleeve twisted beneath him. His face was turned to the side. Skin pale, lips grayed. The left side of his throat showed faint reddish blooming petechiae. Maybe, or maybe something else. A base medic in a reflective vest stood up and shook his head at no one in particular. Probably heat sink and stress collapse. He said, already turning to repack a basic field kit, oxygen intake down. Here's marginal with the outer baffles rerouted. Kid probably skipped breakfast and stood too fast. Another tech muttered that the corridor filters had been running hard all morning. Camille stepped past them and crouched by the body. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct. Instead, she pulled a small case from her belt and thumbed open the VOC sniffer, a chemical detector the size of her palm. The device lit with a soft hum. It blinked once, then again. The medic glanced sideways and frowned. That thing even calibrated half the lab sealed up for the storm. You trying to prove something with handhelds? Camille didn't answer. She turned the sniffer toward the intake vent above the floor, angled it toward the technician's collar, then to the edge of the supply grate where moisture collected in small, repeating patterns. Each location triggered the same faint response. Not alarm level, just presence. She stood slowly and ran a glove across the closest vent surface. No residue, no smell, but her fingertips picked up a chill that wasn't matched by ambient air. She checked the barometer reading built into her sleeve, slightly off baseline. Just enough to notice if you were looking for it. A corporal leaned against the wall behind her and said, mostly to himself, "Storm's messing with airflow. Probably just condensation." He didn't sound like he believed it. He just sounded tired. Camille lifted her eyes and scanned the ceiling for the nearest return line. It was active. Too active. Emergency routing had redirected filtered recirculation to unused corridors, something she remembered from the lockdown brief, which no one else had reviewed in detail. She glanced once toward the medic's open bag. A labeled air slide, used and capped, sat beside a bundled gauze wrap. She stepped closer, calm and unhurried, and bent as if adjusting her boot zip. When she rose, the slide was in her glove. The med tech turned to her. "Still organizing vials? We've got this one. Appreciate the enthusiasm, Lieutenant, but we're keeping it procedural down here." Camille nodded without expression. She offered no disagreement, no confirmation. Her gloves folded over the edge of her pockets as she stepped backward, gaze fixed briefly on the tech's arm. The bruising was too symmetric. A collapse doesn't cause that. Not from a fall. Not like this. She turned without a word and moved back into the corridor. The lights flickered again, pulse. Pause. Repeat. The sound of the hatch resealing behind her made the floor shift under her boots. The storm outside was still climbing. And inside, the air no longer felt neutral. She slipped the slide into a secondary pouch sewn into the inner flap of her outer jacket. She didn't label it. She didn't need to. The sniffer was still humming faintly in her other hand. She waited until she was beyond the second junction before powering it down. The voice of the medic echoed faintly through the corridor as she left. He was laughing at something the corporal said, something about training wheels and ghost chasers. Camille didn't react. Her mind had already moved back to the airflow map in her binder and the vault index she kept logged in her offline notes. It wasn't fear that moved her faster through the darkening base. It was the quiet certainty that she'd seen this before, just never inside a live zone. And if anyone else had noticed, they weren't saying it. They found the second body less than 12 hours later, this time collapsed behind a wheeled cargo rack outside the stairwell to the upper maintenance bay. The logistics runner had missed 2 check-ins. When they located him, his posture was slack against the wall, head tilted sideways, lips faintly gray, and one eye bruised in a pattern too clean to be blunt force. No trauma, no struggle, just the same quiet drift toward stillness that no one wanted to name. Camille heard about it through an encrypted maintenance thread she still had partial access to. It wasn't flagged as a medical concern. The message labeled it a heat reaction during internal reroute non-combatant. Low priority. Logged as resolved. She copied the timestamp, noted the corridor designation, and reopened the airflow schematic she kept in her personal system partition. Line 3 Alpha. The same emergency ductwork vector that looped through the logistics wing and curved around the sealed edge of the west corridor where the first body had fallen. She pulled the layer overlay and began mapping intersection points vents. Intakes. Pressure releases any junction that shared return flow across sectors currently active under the lockdown storm routing. Her fingers moved quickly. Not rushed. Just steady. She circled each intersection in red. Save in total. 2 of them had low-level incidents logged in the past 24 hours. 1 for nausea and dizziness. 1 for fatigue. All dismissed. She underlined the connecting span, then opened a secondary window tied to legacy pathogen simulations from her archived records. CBRN, Exercise 99 Echo. She remembered it for its ambition, more than its approval. The model had been designed to simulate microdose dispersal under environmental stress, high humidity, limited filtration, and rerouted airflow. The simulation had stalled during Phase 2 because it predicted non-lethal but measurable organ stress within 48 hours. Not fatal, just disruptive, but enough to be flagged. The file had been removed from circulation, at least on paper. She pulled it up again. The dispersal model looked familiar. The overlap was unmistakable. She cross-referenced it against current atmospheric telemetry. The barometric shifts caused by the storm matched the model's parameters with less than 2% deviation, still seated in the dark of her lab. She opened a drawer beside the secondary monitor. Inside, her handwritten logs. She flipped through entries until she found a page from 6 months earlier notations in black and red, marked with exposure symbols that had long since been deprecated from base-wide use. She held the page beside the simulation window, sector by sector. The drift lines matched. A quiet knock came at the lab door. Not loud, just protocol. A duty officer leaned into the frame. His uniform was half-soaked from the storm mist. His tone was casual, but his posture wasn't. He kept one hand near the door rail and the other on his belt. Lieutenant Voss. Got a report that you've been accessing restricted simulation directories. Camille didn't look up right away. She finished circling the last vector point before rotating toward him. They're archived, not restricted, and they're relevant. The officer's mouth pressed into a polite smile. Look, no one's saying you don't know your field, but this lockdown's chewing power, and we're trying to keep people from running parallel diagnostics that haven't been cleared by medical. Base Command is handling this. Camille tapped the corner of the log page. 2 bodies. Same intake route. Same corridor overlap. Same temperature curve. If that's a coincidence, I'd like someone else to show the math. The officer stepped in just far enough to let the door hiss closed behind him. He lowered his voice. You're not wrong to look. But you know how this works. If it's not confirmed, it doesn't exist. You don't want to be the one turning rumor into panic. She didn't blink. Panic isn't the problem. Quite is. He didn't answer. Just nodded. Stepped back into the hallway. And let the door reseal without another word. Camille turned back to her monitor. Her hands moved with more focus now. Pulling access logs from the cold storage vault. One caught her eye. A retrieval signature 36 hours ago. A vault labeled VX Low Yield Series. Listed, expired, tagged, destroyed. But the access had cleared. Not with her name. Not with anyone active. The badge used belonged to a civilian contractor, marked deceased 9 months earlier. She scanned the security log a second time, then printed the metadata onto a narrow strip and taped it to her binder. One word marked the bottom of the file, Resilience Cascade. The same phrase used in the proposal for the deactivated dispersal model. No alert had gone out. No containment orders. Just rerouted air. Procedural assumptions. And a string of quiet deaths labeled manageable. Camille leaned forward, tapping her pen against the third junction in the overlay. The data didn't shout. It whispered. And only if you were still enough to hear it. The shift to condition black came without warning. One moment the corridor feeds were running their looped thermal overlays, and the next, all but essential nodes blinked out, replaced by a rotating base seal and a quiet pulse that echoed once through the floor before everything dimmed. Camille stood in front of her terminal as the lights lowered to their minimum safe threshold and the intercom dropped to static. Her clearance badge pinged twice in red when she reached for the hatch. No exit allowed from the CBRN wing. Containment protocole enforced. She didn't try again. Inside the lab, the air grew colder. Not by much, but enough to make her breath feel heavier. She moved back to the main console and started shifting to analog backups, powering up the auxiliary board that still carried enough current to drive short-range environmental logs. The system took a moment to respond. Then the familiar hum returned low. Narrowband. Filtered through machinery that hadn't been tested in months. She didn't need it to be fast. She needed it to be honest. The airflow schematic she'd printed the day before lay curled under a taped-down edge of her notebook. Thermal paper. Faded along one corner. Still readable. She scanned the baffle map with a red pen, cross-referencing vent patterns against the modified emergency protocols issued under hurricane guidance. Every corridor now lit under the same sequence modeled in Resilience Cascade. It was too perfect. Too clean. Wind pressure across emergency ducts. Pressure reversal on the midlines. Even the humidity curve matched the archive dispersal phase from Exercise 99 Echo. Not one deviation out of bounds. The screen in front of her blinked again, briefly shifting from local control back to base-wide lockdown overlay. Her terminal account had already been suspended. She couldn't push findings up the net. Not without encryption codes, routed through the command stack. And she didn't have those anymore. Camille returned to her desk and opened the older terminal. The one that still ran on an independent drive not wired to shared systems. She keyed in a local path and accessed her off-grid archive. The Resilience Cascade file loaded slowly, but it opened. The signature date was older than she remembered. The language inside was colder. Phase simulation seeks non-lethal disruption at scale. Deploy under non-reportable conditions. Evaluate human response under layered uncertainty. There was no mention of the virus by name. Only the vector curves. Only airflow logic. Camille leaned back, the chair creaking beneath her. Her hand moved toward the sealed sample vial on the corner shelf. She had logged it 2 days ago. Before any official alerts, it bore a faded, handwritten tag and a tracemark ID. Not officially stored. not officially destroyed. She picked up the vial, turned it once in her palm, then slid it into a shielded pouch on her vest. The override file remained open on her screen. A knock came at the sealed hatch. Not loud. A 2 count. Someone used her name. She keyed the external comms panel and watched the image come through on the grainy, half-powered screen. A systems officer stood in the hallway, half lit by the flicker of a failing corridor panel. His voice came through muffled. "You need to stop pulling from the resilience chain. That's not your lane." Camille didn't answer. The man stepped closer. "You're not cleared to stop a scenario we didn't launch." She stared at the screen for 3 full seconds before replying. Her voice stayed level. "But it's running." He didn't blink. "And it'll end clean. That's how it was written. You log anything beyond local, you'll trigger flags that make things worse than they are." Camille reached down and shut off the comm channel. The hatch remained locked. She returned to her notes. Flipping to a half-used log page from a year earlier, the same airflow arc, the same staggered heat signature pattern, she circled the corridor loop one more time in red, then drew a box around the manual decon switch labeled on the backup schematic. She had seen it once, buried beneath a floor panel near the west subduct. It was meant for legacy use only, never integrated into the new command net. Dust had settled across its bracket when she passed it last. Camille folded the page, slid it into her jacket, and packed the vial and the sniffer into her kit. The hatch stayed closed behind her. The only path forward now led underground. Through the crawl space she wasn't authorized to access anymore. She stepped toward the panel and felt the faint click of the floor beneath her. Not a warning. Just structure adjusting to pressure. The kind of sound that happened when a building breathed in too long. The bass wasn't quiet because it had gone still. It was quiet because no one was allowed to speak. Camille moved quickly through the lower access corridor, the kind that looped beneath the generator wing, like an afterthought, a sublevel not included on the digital maps anymore. But she remembered its layout from her first assignment tour. Her gloves were already damp by the time she reached the first crawl hatch. The outer seal hissed slightly when she cracked it open, the stale air from below rushing past her as she dropped onto the ladder and descended into heat. The crawl space was narrow, lined with old maintenance piping and insulated cables that pulsed with residual warmth. Some carried power. Others hadn't been active in years. She worked her way forward on elbows and knees, pressing through coils of wiring and rust-dusted support grates. Her pack snagged twice on the brackets overhead. The third time, she unlatched it and pushed it ahead. The floor below vibrated faintly with the pressure of failing systems cycling under stress. She reached the manual baffle intake line, just past a service crosspoint, where 3 vents converged before routing into the wider distribution manifold. The valve handle was still capped. A thin layer of dust clung to its surface. The tag, faded and peeling. Read emergency only, vent 2, B alpha. Manual override must be logged. No one had touched it in years. Camille set the small portable scrubber next to the junction. It was a unit rated for localized field use, the kind issued for platoon-level incidents, not built for infrastructure. Definitely not meant for central line purification. But it had an adaptive filter and a pressure tolerance she had tested once in the desert, just enough to hold if patched into the loop slowly. Just enough to buy time. She opened her kit and laid out the clamp adapters. 1 wrench, 1 bypass port, and the override slip she had written out earlier by hand. Her name, her badge number, time, and action. She had no access to the digital log. The valve resisted. She leaned into it with her shoulder, slipping once and slamming her elbow against the frame. Pain spiked down her arm. She ground her boots into the cross piping and braced again. The metal creaked, then gave. A sharp hiss filled the crawl space as pressure shifted through the intake line. The vent above her groaned. The scrubber clicked twice and blinked green. Then amber. then green again. Not perfect, but live. Camille watched the pressure stabilize. The gauge hovered at just below maximum sustainable flow. It would hold, maybe not long, but long enough to bleed the contaminated cycle and reroute fresh circulation through auxiliary branches. She reached for the log slip and slid it into the manual file slot bolted to the junction bracket. It would be found eventually. Maybe. If someone checked the records. If someone cared. Her fingers trembled slightly as she latched the panel shut. Not from fear. Not from exhaustion. Just the crash of spent adrenaline and recycled air. Her shoulders were slick with sweat beneath the suit. One knee was bleeding through her pants, where she'd scraped against a torn edge of vent housing. She crawled back the way she came. Slower now. The vent hum had changed behind her. Softer. Cleaner. The deep ozone tang in the air had begun to fade, replaced by the sterile, mechanical scent of overworked filters, doing what they were never designed to do. By the time she pulled herself back up into the corridor, her arms shook with effort. She leaned against the wall and let her breath settle. One hand pressed flat to the floor to steady her balance. In the stillness, she felt the faint vibration of systems cycling, smoothing out. No alarm had gone off. No acknowledgement had been sent. But the corridor felt different. Cooler. Quieter. Like something exhaled for the first time in days. Camille stood and slung her gear over one shoulder. She reached into her jacket and pulled the field sniffer from its pouch. A single test. One pass. It blinked green. She turned and walked back toward the lab. The lights didn't flicker this time. The air no longer felt heavy. Somewhere in the background, a relay clicked as the new airflow synced into place. No one saw her. No one had called for it. But the system had been saved by a valve. No one remembered, a tool not designed for it, and a woman who hadn't waited to be asked. By the time the clouds thinned and the wind quieted, the base had already begun its reset. Sunlight pushed through narrow gaps in the upper skylights, casting pale lines across the floor of the admin corridor, where wet footprints faded quickly under dry air. Emergency status was lifted at 0700. Power rerouted. Network nodes came back online. The storm was declared, cleared. Within hours, the first inspectors arrived, 2 from Environmental Command, 1 from Fleet Systems Audit. They moved with quiet precision, carrying tablets and checklist folders, making notations beside sealed doors and asking low questions in passing. No one seemed hurried. No one seemed worried. Contamination logs showed minor anomalies in circulation, nothing outside emergency tolerance. The system report marked a brief surge in atmospheric turbulence, followed by a clean drop and stable readout. Incident summary non-critical. Resolution autocorrected. Camille stood outside the CBRN wing, while 2 men from facilities catalogued her station. One glanced at her nameplate before unscrewing it. He didn't ask. He didn't meet her eyes. The other sealed a cardboard box marked personal effects. Her binder, her tools. The sniffer still packed in foam. No one mentioned the crawlspace valve. No one referenced the log slip. The digital record had been purged of her entry. The override field now read null input. System reset by thermal surge. A logistics coordinator approached her with a clipboard and a thin envelope. His voice was pleasant. Lieutenant Voss, your reassignment has been processed. Civilian contract support. Mid-band diagnostics. West Arlington Labs. Starts next week. You'll find all the details here. He handed her the envelope without pausing. She took it. Said nothing. He nodded once and moved on, already calling the next name on his list. She watched as 2 technicians walked past her with air quality meters and disposable booties. One laughed quietly about the smell in sublevel 4. The other said the filters probably burned themselves out chasing old mold. They disappeared down the stairwell without ever knowing. In her jacket pocket, the sample slide remained, where she had tucked it days ago. Still sealed, still marked. She hadn't filed it. There was no place left to send it. Her quarters had already been swept. The cot stripped. The locker emptied. She was told she could collect her gear any time before 1600. A plastic crate waited beside the door. Inside it, folded neatly, was her base-issue jacket. Still bearing the patch no one had asked her to remove. She signed the exit form without a word. The clerk didn't look up. Outside, the sunlight looked clean but tasted metallic at the back of her throat. She walked to the edge of the lot where the temporary shuttles waited. One other person stood in line, staring at their phone, earbuds in. Camille didn't speak. She held the crate in one arm and the envelope in the other. The box was light. Most of what mattered had already been erased. The air was calm now. No alarms. No signal pings. No red lights flashing in the dark. Just one slip of paper, still folded in her back pocket. And the knowledge that she had turned the valve with no one watching. The transit station hummed with ordinary rhythm. Soft announcements rose and faded in even tones. Boarding notices layered over the occasional scrape of luggage wheels and the distant hiss of a vending machine resetting. Light pooled through high windows, casting long reflections across the polished floor. Camille sat near the far wall. A gray bench, angled just enough to avoid the crowds moving toward the exit. In her lap rested a printed copy of the official report. The front page bore the base crest, followed by summary language that made no one responsible. Environmental fluctuation. Minor systems deviation. All resolved within tolerance. Final line, negligible effect. No. Corrective action required. She turned to the last page and stared at the signatures. Not hers. Beside the report, her notebook lay open to the folded insert she'd carried since the crawl space. It held a hand-drawn airflow arc, 3 vent marks, an exposure decay, times scribbled in pencil. At the bottom, a question she had written quietly the night before she left. What were they really trying to measure? The paper felt warm in the sunlight. She flipped the notebook shut and tucked it into the inner sleeve of her coat. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the sample slide, still sealed in its plastic wrap. No one had asked for it. No one ever would. Around here, travelers came and went. A mother zipped a child into a hoodie. A man in work boots talked softly into a phone. The world moved forward. Camille didn't shift in her seat. She didn't speak. She let the moments pass without urgency. She had done what she could, not to save a base, not to prove anything, only to leave behind one clean line in a place that would rather forget. She didn't carry a legacy. She carried the record. She was never asked to act, never invited into the briefing. Her name wasn't on the call sheet when the system began to fail. But Camille Voss didn't wait for approval. She read the air, followed the signs others ignored, and stepped into the crawl space no one else would enter. Alone, without recognition. She turned the valve that changed the outcome, not with force, but with quiet certainty. The system erased her afterward, scrubbed her name, boxed hair gear, and moved on. But she knew what she had done. And that knowing was enough. Not every act of courage is loud. Not every victory is seen. Sometimes the strongest ones are carried by those who never ask for credit. If this story spoke to you, take a moment to reflect, leave a comment, or follow for more stories that honor the quiet strength behind the silence.